I'm Gwinn Vivian. I'm here today to discuss my time in archaeology and what I'm currently doing, and give a little information on what had happened, particularly in a place called Chaco Canyon in northern New Mexico. Recording this in Tucson, Arizona on December 8th, 2020. Basically, my plan was to discuss today how my archaeology currently is related to what has been being done in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, over a very long period of time. And I realized that I need to also bring my history, in a sense, up to date by relating what my current, or actually my last job, although I'm continuing to do a lot of archaeological work, was at the Arizona State Museum in Tucson on the campus at the University of Arizona. Well, I should say that I should actually begin with my father, who came to Arizona. He was in a family of copper miners who left Ireland, came and settled in northern New Mexico, and they then at one point, my father, because there was a lot of copper mining in Globe, Arizona, was there as a small child. His father didn't have any intention of being a copper miner. So he established a dairy, which became one of the best dairies in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So my father then grew up in Albuquerque, and as a high school student, he spent virtually every weekend on his bicycle, going all over central New Mexico, looking at archaeological sites. So from a very early time, he had made it extremely clear he wasn't going to be running a dairy, that instead what he really wanted to do was to do archaeology. And he, in some ways, was quite fortunate because Edgar L. Hewitt, at that time, was the head of the Department of Archaeology at the University of New Mexico. And Dad went there, and in a relatively short time established a good working relationship with Hewitt. And Hewitt at that time was involved in doing a number of things. One of them was establishing the Antiquities Act of 1906. That was something that he felt very critically important, and that in turn helped him to, in a sense, dislodge the Wetherells, who were doing a lot of excavation in Chaco Canyon at Pueblo Bonito. And this bothered a number of people. So my father, as a result of being a student of Edgar L. Hewitt, wound up quite early working in Chaco. And that was something that stuck with him actually for the rest of his life. Hewitt was at that time, when the Wetherells were digging Pueblo Bonito, Hewitt established a camp near Chetroketl, the next great house to the east in the canyon, and set up a field school in the summer there. He had the field school in the Jemez area, but then he also established this field school in the area of Chetroketl. And that is, in fact, where my father initially was introduced to the archaeology of Chaco Canyon. The Wetherells were actually sort of pushed out of doing archaeology in Chaco, and But before that could happen, and at that, as that was happening, um, the the excavations in Pueblo Bonito were such that Hewitt complained that the dust from those excavations was causing problems, health problems for his students, and moved the field school at that time across the canyon to the small group of small house sites called the BC sites. My father was with him at that time and moved over and was given the responsibility quite early on of digging one of those great kivas, Rinconada, which he did, and also at that time then realized the need. It's interesting in that he recognized very early the need then for the stabilization of that site so it wouldn't continue to fall in on itself. The other interesting thing that I think he did is that he dumped all of his back dirt, that is my father, from that excavation on what would have been a flight of masonry steps going up from the canyon bottom up to the Great Kiva. He was not aware at that time that that was the situation, but he nonetheless did a great job and established, actually stabilized Rinconada. Hewitt at that time was concerned that Earl Morris had dug the first great kiva in the Chacoan area, in the Aztec area. And so I think that what Hewitt decided was if he couldn't dig the first one, he'd dig more than anybody else, which then led to the excavation of a number of great kivas in Chaco. And in a sense, Hewitt was able to establish quite firmly that he had done a lot of work with great kivas. My father then was employed by Hewitt working at actually what is now Chihuahua State Park or State Monument outside of Bernalillo, New Mexico, and doing both excavation and some stabilization at that site. However, when that job ended, my father briefly for one semester, and at that, right around that time, he had married my mother a year before I was born. So my father, my mother, and me trooped off to Dallas, Texas, to a girls' school where my father taught for one semester. By that time, Hewitt had managed to get additional funding, so I think my father was extremely happy about getting out of Dallas and teaching co-eds and being able to move back to Chaco. He did that with another archaeologist, Paul Ryder, and the two of them each then, since we were moving back to Chaco, the field school system buildings were being moved to the south side of the canyon. At any rate, at that time, my father built a very large masonry hogan, and that was the house that I lived in initially when we went to Chaco. It's interesting, I have a rug on the wall in my house currently now, which in the early photographs of the interior of that hogan where we lived, the rug at that time's on the bed. So fortunately they were taking care of it even at that early time. My father and my mother and were living in a hogan in Chaco, and my father then was given the responsibility for building the new field school station on the south side of the canyon, which he did with Paul Ryder. And we then continued. My sister Ann was born a year later, and so the Vivian family then lived first in the hogan and then in one of the buildings that my father had built for the field school until actually World War II came about, at which time my father joined the Army Corps of Engineers, and we were all over Texas for a couple of years. When the war ended, my father in no time at all got right back to Chaco. And fortunately, the Park Service was very good about that, because that's where he wanted to be. And that was 1947. So we went back in the summer of 1947. My father was well established. He used the old Wetherill Trading Post as his office. We lived next to the old Wetherill building, which unfortunately, a number of years ago, the National Park Service ripped to the ground all of the buildings that were related to the Wetherill establishment in Chaco. So I then, like I say, went back in 1947 as a kid to Chaco. I remember that when we got there, the first morning, I took a shovel and went out and began digging in the Pueblo Bonito refuse mound. And my father showed up and suggested that that was not a good idea, which then led to me beginning to do more surveying rather than digging, which in turn led to me getting very interested in the early Navajo archaeology of Chaco Canyon. That then eventually led to me doing a complete survey of the Chakra Mesa, all the way from the end of Chaco Canyon up to well beyond the end of the mesa to the east of the canyon. That produced a considerably significant amount of information on early Navajo occupation in the Chaco area. Okay, I'm being reminded of a time in Chaco when at that time we were still living on the south side of the canyon. And the Park Service, this was the winter, it was a very wet winter, and the Park Service became aware of the fact that threatening rock, this large slab of rock behind Pueblo Bonito, was moving. And so there was considerable concern about if it fell. So they had, Bob Lister, for example, one of the jobs he had was going out almost every morning, going up on the cliff, jumping between the two, threatening rock and the cliff, to measure the distance to see if it was getting any wider, which it was, but he kept doing this. At any rate, my mother said that she had, we were, like I say, we were still living on the west side of the canyon, and a group of ladies of the canyon, the superintendent's wife and a ranger's wife, and my mother met for coffee in the morning once a week. At any rate, they were sitting there when they heard this incredible crash, ran out having fairly good idea of what had happened, and threatening rock had come down. And quite insanely, they all rushed over in my mother's car, and began climbing all over this broken up rock, which was still pieces of it falling down. Finally, I guess they were smart enough to realize that was not a very bright idea, and so backed off. But it's important to note that this was one of the things that also did happen while we were living in the canyon, was that threatening rock came down at it was in December 1937, I believe. Yeah. Hewitt, no, actually, He was certainly living, but I think I was 3 or 4 at the time. So yeah, I may have shaked his hand, as a matter of fact, since my father was working for him. But I don't remember him in person, and this would have been the absolute best time for us, my sister and I, to have learned Navajo. But at that time, the Navajos mostly wanted to learn to speak good English. And I'm sure that if this Tomasito was her name, and I'm sure that if my mother had told her, look, begin speaking Navajo to him, she would have. But it's so strange that that didn't even occur to my parents at that time. So, no, I didn't, yatahe and so on. Yeah, my education was that basically I had sort of my mother taught us in Chaco until she said we were getting to be wild little Indians and moved, that's when we moved up to Farmington, like I've said, or Aztec, but that ended with World War II, and that brought us back to Albuquerque, and so from that point on I was attending schools, public schools in Albuquerque. Through my through high school, and actually I also then got my BA and MA at University of New Mexico. But that was done also in conjunction with carrying out research in Chaco, particularly on the Navajo. Like I say, I was always very much interested in the Navajo occupation of the canyon and their gradual movement from the east into the canyon, and basically then wrote my MA thesis on the Navajo occupation of Chaco Canyon. My wife and I were married. I was in the Army. When we saved our money, when I got out of the Army, we decided we would live in Mexico until the money ran out, which it did. Before long, I came back, or we came back to the States. We had $36, I remember that. My father greeted me the morning after we arrived and said, well, you have an appointment with Charlie Steen at the Arizona State Museum for a job down there, and get a haircut. So that's what I did. And that led me then to the Arizona State Museum, where I was for many, many, many years, decades, eventually being the associate director of the museum and establishing their salvage, at that time what was called salvage archaeology program. And until I retired. Since that time, I've been involved with still a number of people involved with the museum and other individuals working particularly on Chacoan prehistory. That's been the most recent project I've had, working with a young woman in University of Colorado at Denver, at Boulder. And she has been, Samantha Sam Flad, has been doing a lot of really, really great work in Chaco, and which pleases me a great deal, because essentially what she's doing is helping to wrap up a lot of the information that we gathered over a long, long period of time, which essentially brings me right up to the present, and that Sam and I are wrapping up what will be a very large report on the most recent work being done in Chaco. Well, yes, my PhD. I came, well, like I may have said that when we got out of the Army, I think I've already noted this, my wife and I had saved money and we decided we moved to Mexico. Okay, when we had $35, we came home. My father took me right down and got me a job at the Arizona State Museum. I was perfectly happy doing that, And then in one fateful trip with the Ray Thompson to Phoenix, we went up, and when we came back, I was signed up to get into the PhD program. It was as simple as that. No, he made it very clear, and he was an absolutely perfect person because he understood my need to continue working, but at the same time made all kinds of helped me do things in order to get signed up and proceed through taking the required courses there and passing the exams towards getting my PhD out of Arizona. And that was, I owe him an incredible amount for doing that. So anyway, that then I in a way became, I was wound up trying to do as much field work as I could, but wound up also at the same time running this large program which we were involved with, because this was a time of a lot of contract archaeology. This was when Lynn Teague was involved doing all kinds of projects. And so much of my time was spent in doing those kinds of jobs, looking for projects, writing contracts, and so on, and which I continued to do until I realized I needed some time to do my own work. Is when then I stepped down and went back to being an archaeologist at the Arizona State Museum, and was no longer the associate director, which was a good move. And I was there for 3 or 4 more years, having the opportunity to carry out more of my research, which, like I say, was really critically important to me. A lot of archaeologists interesting at that time didn't want to be bothered. That was work for people who couldn't get a PhD or maybe even get an MA. And so it was looked down on in terms of the kind of job you could have, which really irritated me considerably, because the work that was involved was very important. It gave people an enormous amount of field experience, and they were responsible for writing up the research, publishing the reports, and in many cases doing more publishing than the people who just stayed behind and were just professors. So that, again, this was something that made me, well, it was a very pleasant thing to be able to see that I could be involved in a project that would lead to the continued publication of these individuals, and in many cases, their eventual moving on into an advanced degree, which I totally always supported. And and then I had wonderful people, like I've already mentioned, Lynn Teague, who once I mentioned the fact that she might want to quit and get a PhD, and she said, "What for? I'm happy. I'm doing what I want to do, and I'm doing a lot more research than if I went and got a PhD." And I thought, boy, she's right on. She's written a number of really, really good things. Yeah, the textiles, yeah, that was, at the same time she was doing all this work, she was at home on her loom madly weaving. Yeah, she's a lady of many talents, and absolutely unbelievable person to work. I was going to say, to work for. She's, because she knew what she was doing. I couldn't have been more fortunate than to work with her. Yeah, Lynn Teague worked at the Arizona State Museum for quite a number of years, essentially developing our contract program, in which we were, when this was established, a number of major projects relating to water control, for example, in the Southwest. Water control in terms of current modern water control was going on. Building of enormous water systems. And Lynn recognized very early on that this was, if we were going to do the work, that we needed to have a better understanding of what was going on. So she then got involved and not only developed the contracts for doing this kind of work, but carrying out many of those jobs herself. We were talking about Lynn Teague, who ran our contract program, and was the absolute right person for the job. I remember a couple of male PhDs who taught in the department who didn't have the same opinion, but they were jerks. And you know, come on, folks. She was being evaluated on the basis of having only an MA, and that really irritated me. You can't imagine how much, especially when those people were, she had so far outpublished them it wasn't even funny. Anyway, I shall get off my that particular soapbox. She was a perfect person to have doing the job that she was doing. Okay, what I would like to do now is begin discussing some of the most recent work that I have done that relates to the prehistory of Chaco Canyon. I'm incredibly lucky in that I have been working with a young woman who has done work in Chaco and is currently working on developing a final major report on some of the archaeology that's been done there in the last, about 5 years. This is Samantha Fletcher, known as Sam, who now is at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And she worked in Chaco with Steve Plog, and is just a brilliant, brilliant young woman who very fortunately is at times far more literate than I am with respect to getting material down on paper that makes sense. So Sam and I have been working together to wrap up a lot of the archaeology that has been recently done there. And one of the things that I have felt most strongly about is the fact that over time, the emphasis on Chacoan archaeology has almost always been on great houses. And I think this is a terrible, terrible mistake. Fortunately, Samantha agrees with me. However, the vast majority of archaeologists still really only focus on great houses. Nothing against him, but one of the most strongest person doing that is Steve Flexen, who is interpreting Chaco in a very interesting way. Let me put it that way. And so it's been really nice to find that someone like Samantha agrees with me that what hasn't been done over a long period of time is emphasize the critical importance of small house sites in Chaco Canyon. And that is particularly relevant with respect to agriculture. In the canyon, there's a considerable difference with respect to how one can farm on the north and the south sides of the canyon. On the north side, the drainages that come off from the cliff flow directly, in a sense, right into the canyon, so that if that water is not caught and managed quite quickly, it's lost, and it's no good for any kind of agriculture. What the archaeologists working there ultimately realized was that what the prehistoric Chacoans had done was capture all that water in elaborate water control systems to deliver to the fields. However, at the same time, that that was the emphasis on doing agriculture in Chaco. Not much attention was paid, as I've noted, to what small house sites were doing. That's one of the areas that recently has considerably much greater work been spent. They're looking at how small house sites have adapted to the agricultural potential on that side of the canyon, and the potential is enormous. They're not in a sense restricted to one kind, capturing water and running it to fields, but there are all kinds of other methods for farming that are quite useful and can be carried out on the south side of the canyon. Much of the recent work that I have been doing is focusing on those alternative means for doing farming on the south side of the canyon, estimating not critically, but estimating the amount of production that can be achieved by using these multiple kinds of systems on the south side of the canyon. So that has been working with Samantha over the past couple of years has made me feel really good, because for once it is emphasizing again the critical importance of those small house sites. Steve Lexon, for example, just refers to them as sort of peasants farming around the edges, but clearly that is not the case. The kinds of systems that were carried out by small house sites were far more complex, more diverse, and as a result of that, probably produced greater quantities of food in the canyon than was being produced on the north side. So that has been much of what I've been looking at recently in terms of trying to interpret how people made it over a long period of years. Ultimately, what happened in Chaco, it happened early on in the late 700s when an extremely dry period hit Chaco and drove a lot of people out of Chaco. They went north. Eventually in the 900s they came back into Chaco and were there until the early 1200s, when again an incredibly dry period hit the canyon. And so we see the reverse of it again, people moving out of the canyon and again then moving back north, where southern Colorado, northwestern New Mexico, where the potential for doing agriculture is much greater than you could possibly ever do in the canyon. And so the canyon was really, after say 1250, pretty much abandoned. People from the Mesa Verde wandered through, but didn't spend any time there on their way east to the Rio Grande Valley. That Chaco then was, at that period of time, being the early 1200s, it was realized that no longer was it a viable place to be a farmer. That's it. The alternatives for farming on that side are much greater. On the north, you are limited simply to collecting that water and running it to a field. On the south, it collects in different places where you can actually save it or run it to fields, or the potential for different kinds of fields is much greater, which means that the smart people in Chaco lived on the south side of the canyon when it came to farming. Yeah, there was actually Navajo agriculture in the canyon in a few places. Hueritos Fields was one of those. And in South Gap, there was a Navajo family there. They were living there when we were living there and farming, collecting water again off from, it was runoff, and running down to their fields. And they were able to make it. The Park Service moved. There was an elderly woman whose family lived there. And they the Park Service, she was on Park Service land. And so the Park Service, even though she was like, what, a quarter of a mile from the border of the monument, and it was a monument at that time, nonetheless, the Park Service felt she had to go. So they came over with their trucks, packed up her relatives, all of their stuff, and took it up to a place that the woman owned on the mesa at the top of the canyon near the Excavated Wash. And the Park Service came by the next day, and she was already back in her house in the canyon. And that, at that time, it was really mean, because what they did, they moved her again, and at that time tore her houses down, and did not even move that material up to the top. Fortunately, she had a hogan up there that she could live in. But this was, well, it was stupidity on the part of that. She wasn't going to be there forever, and they should have left her, because she, in a sense, in a very strong sense, reflected past use of the canyon. When the Wetherells were there, there was a big community out in South Gap of the Navajo living there. They were well established all over the canyon bottom, and unfortunately, they got kicked out. With respect to then the quantity of people living in Chaco, I think that population fluctuated over time, reflecting changes in the environment. Great houses never were populated as greatly as I think a lot of people think that they were. On the other hand, I think that small house populations were always they did sufficient for the land that they had to be able to provide for themselves. And I've already mentioned Samantha, but that's one of the most recent things that's happened to me is to be able to meet her and work with her, because it is so great to work with young people who have an interest in Chaco, who are in many respects a lot smarter than I am, and who are quite willing to share. And that's one of the things that is so wonderful about Sam, and why I'm so extremely pleased that this ultimate publication, which the University of Utah Press is willing to take, that she will be the lead author. It just makes sense that should happen, because she's been extremely generous with her time, and it just boils down. It's sort of neat to find young people still doing that, willing to accept with old codgers like me, who still sort of make their way out to Chaco, which I intend to. I'm going to get there this summer for sure. Yeah, absolutely. The publication that we're working on now looks at Chaco in a much broader historical perspective, in terms of the frequent movements of people from the lower southern Colorado, northwestern New Mexico, into Chaco, being in Chaco for a while, moving back to that place, and coming back again. It has been this really, like I say, interesting movement, which Samantha and I have been able to document and show that once it became feasible to do farming in Chaco, people moved back in. But they were also smart enough to know when times got tough, it was important to have a place. And this is the interesting thing. They have seemingly had connections in the north, that they then had a place to go back to where they would have been welcomed and not considered as intruders. So we see over time then this, at least on two occasions, the movement south, back to the north, south, and then back to the north. Ultimately, I think things just stayed too dry in Chaco, and by that time there were alternative different groups were moving into the Rio Grande Valley, and Chaco just didn't become a place anymore where we could expect that in the canyon there was going to be another revival of people living there. It happened twice, and that was it. There wasn't any more. I guess what I would say is that the Navajos in Chaco Canyon have got to be identifiable as Navajos, and I would guess that as Navajos, I wouldn't see them moving into the canyon much before the 1600s. Yeah, they almost certainly post-date the more Puebloan occupation of Chaco Canyon. Yeah, and then once established, pretty much really became quite numerous in Chaco. And in addition, as I've already said, up on the Chacro Mesa, that's where we collected a lot of the early Navajo evidence for early Navajo occupation that wound up in my MA thesis. And interestingly enough, they're still there. This is some of the same families that were there when Judd was there are still there. They occupy the drainage to the north, the Escavada wash, and some of these the Cly family, Cly and Clydes, the same family, but some were Clydes, others were Cly, and they have been there and are still there. So I think that's really great. It's not easy for them anymore, certainly with being able to make a living out there. But it's great that they are all still there, for sure. I would guess there are still a fair number of Navajo living at the eastern end of the canyon and up on the Chacro Mesa. I bet you they've been there for generations and generations. Yeah. Simply because they've been able to. They didn't have the Park Service pushing them out of like the canyon, which they did in Chaco. And it's at a higher elevation, which means there's more precipitation. It's a sheep raising, and they also are into cattle now up there. The forage is better up there. So it's not surprising to me that we haven't seen, well, there's very little place left in Chaco Canyon where they could come. Actually, at Pueblo Pintado now, at the very eastern end of Chaco, there are quite a few Navajo there who just filter ever so slightly into the very headwaters of the Chaco. So you could say, in a sense, then, yeah, there are still Navajo in the Chaco area, but the vast number of those then continue on to the east, and those populations, I'm sure, well, there are historic Navajo sites up there, and I'm sure that it's the same families in many cases that are living there. Yeah, one of the biggest challenges, and it was my fault, was finding the time to start doing some of the research myself rather than administering that research. And like I say, my last 3 years there fortunately involved me being out of an administrative position and being able to do more evaluating of, in some cases, archaeological research that I had already done or that I was wanting to do. For example, one of those, and it sort of went, whoops, and that was a trip to India, oh my goodness, quite a number of years ago, led to me going quite north to Ladakh. And I all of a sudden realized that some of the farming in Ladakh reminded me of something that may have been happening in Chaco. And so I got a sabbatical, and my wife and I moved to Ladakh and spent a long summer there with me collecting information on a couple of the small villages that were carrying out water control systems that in some cases were sort of reminiscent of what I think was going on in Chaco. So this was neat for me to be looking at a contemporary system and comparing it to what I think was happening in Chaco prehistorically. So I worked for, let me see, I've worked for several organizations that have tours and to Chaco, and so I haven't done that recently, but I was doing that for some time. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center was the primary location for doing that, and taking actually not only to Chaco, but also we did several that were around the Southwest, looking at, for example, looking at water control systems in different areas, not only Chaco, but there. So, yeah, like I say, I haven't worked for Crow Canyon for some time, but continue to keep in touch with them. They're doing really, really, really great work. And well, it was something that I developed with Crow Canyon over a period of time, was running a lot of tours for them, not only to Chaco, but to various places around the Southwest, which were always very, very pleasant. Crow Canyon is a really great organization, and that was always very, very, very pleasant for me. Yeah. Well, I think, and I've already mentioned it, is that we need to, and I don't know whether it'll happen, we need to spend a lot more time looking at small house sites. There's the emphasis to date has been so strongly over an incredibly long period of time on great houses that we still are missing, I think, a significant opportunity to better understand the workings, and actually what I think are really important, the workings between those two contemporaneous systems operating in the canyon, which is something that hasn't been done. And I think it would be well worth, I don't know how you would approach that actually, but there must be some way in which we could look at what kind of systems, methods might they have had in order to be able to work together. And they being that close in the canyon together, there's no way in the world but to not do that. And obviously, there are far greater opportunities for different kinds of farming on the south side. The north is pretty much restricted. On the south, there's all kinds of opportunities, and I don't know how far that got carried prehistorically. I've already